Perfect, we're recording. And I will start admitting everyone. You guys ready?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So we start with 33 participants. Just all admitting.
Is Lucy one of them?
I'm not sure yet. I will go through them just now. As soon as our guests have activated the audios, I will start welcoming everyone. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and welcome to our third talk on isolation wine. And today we have the incredible privilege to have two wonderful guests with us. So one is obviously Alex, a known face. He is a big expert in New World wines, in Old World wines, in New Zealand and Australian wines, in Burgundy and Beaujolais and Bordeaux and so on. And we also have the immense...
Bordeaux.
Not an actor, but you enjoy a bottle or two every now and then without telling anyone. And we have the incredible privilege to have Jessica Hill-Smith here tonight with us from Australia, where it is 9:30 or 9 p.m. more or less. Thank you so much for joining us at this late hour. Jessica is the sixth generation of the Hill-Smith family, owners of Yalumba, and we will find out more tonight about what she does and about obviously this incredible heritage of her family in wine. In the meantime, as I'm doing a little bit of a small talk and I'm admitting all our guests, we had an incredible response, about 70 participants that are slowly joining in. And I'm also gonna repeat the house rules a bit. For who obviously was here in the first two episodes, they know, but otherwise the talk will last more or less 2 hours. We've prepared a presentation which we will send to everyone after this, and we'll go through the history of Australia and New Zealand, we will go through the regionality, and then talk about the brands. Obviously it is an informative talk and hopefully an entertaining one as well, but the objective for us is obviously also to introduce the wines and allow you to purchase them. We are running, as you know, a small promotion on these wines to incentivize you to purchase them now and receive them after lockdown. We're offering a very, very special price, which is even more special if you consider that the next shipment is gonna come, first of all, not sure when, but then obviously with the rand being so weak, I think, Alex, we discussed it last time, you're gonna save 30-40% if you buy now compared to what you would buy later.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly, obviously, because it'll depend on what the rand is doing. And I'll go into it a little bit later. We have a very special arrangement with Yalumba where they help us minimize the impact of the rand. But there will be a significant increase.
Okay, absolutely. So the way it works, during the talk, you can, and I also ask everyone please to switch off their microphones and switch off their videos, just for our speakers not to be distracted. During the talk, you can write any question in the group chat. So Zoom has a chat within its application. You can just write the question, and I will take note and then ask our speakers during the course of the talk. If you would like to buy some of the wines, which are extremely limited, they are on allocation, some of them only a couple of bottles, please write me a private note on the live chat. I will take note and follow up after the talk. The way it works is on a first come, first served basis. Please understand, we'll try and satisfy everyone, but these wines are extremely limited and in high demand. In our Burgundy talk, we sold out within 1 hour or so. So that's just a note on that. Other than that, I think, Alex, if you're keen, I think I said everything when it comes to house rules. If you would like just to perhaps introduce Jessica a little bit more in depth than what I did, you know her very well personally, and then we can get started.
Sure. Just before I get on to Jessica, what are you drinking, Nick?
Sorry, right. I forgot. The most important thing.
We can't do these sessions without a glass of wine or three.
A fantastic Riesling from the Eden Valley, Pussy Vale, which is one of my absolute favorites, and my last Australian wine in the cellar.
By coincidence, I'm drinking from the same vineyard, but this is This is the Block 61.
Oh, wow.
And
Yes?
we'll make it a trio of.
Well, Riesling's a ritual. It's a ritual in Australia, and I learned that over many years of travel there.
It absolutely is.
Can't,
You start the night on a Fizzy Vale Riesling.
Yeah, well, it seems like you're ending yours, but anyway, and we starting ours,
Yeah.
or you're a late starter. So yes,
Part
please
two.
let me introduce Jess, or Jessica, who is as Nick pointed out, 6th generation of the owning family of Yalumba in the Barossa. The Hill-Smith family. Rob Hill-Smith, her father, is my very good drinking buddy for decades. I think he's lurking in the background somewhere. You're at home.
I'm
You're at
at
your
home.
family home, right? Yeah.
Yes.
In Angaston at the winery. And so Jessica, one of 3 daughters, Lucy and Georgie, and Annabelle, her mum. So they very close-knit family running this incredible business, which we'll go into, called Yalumba, and various other estates and businesses that they own. And Jess, rather like her father did before her, went out into the wide world and got her experience, cut her teeth in other fantastic wine companies. Rob did so with Domaine du Jacques in Burgundy, for example. And Jess ran the PR and marketing side for a very important champagne company based for their operations in Australia, and then went to work in London as well for Metzendorf, which belongs to the Boulanger family. And having gained very good experience in both international markets and high, very premium wines, has joined the family business about a year ago. Did I get that right, Jess?
You nailed it. That was perfect. That's my whole bio.
And your role at Yalumba is very much focusing on so Yalumba, but and specifically on the very top wines and with the sort of the iconic wines within the portfolio, right?
Exactly right.
And we'll be
We
tasting
call it
today.
collection, so our best of the best.
Cool, fantastic. So shall I get stuck in, Nick?
Please, let's try and take in this this amazing map, which might look overwhelming at first, but you can give an introduction. I suppose Australia, winemaking country, and
I think if you go back to the previous page first, there's oh, sorry, maybe it's the next page, the one with the history.
Yes.
There you go. I mean, people can read that, and I think it's important that you do look at the pages as we go through, because there's a lot of content which is relevant, and I don't want to just read the pages out loud.
Yeah.
You know, it'd be boring. But I think there are. When I did the Burgundy talk, I sort of painted a picture of the background to the region, and obviously there isn't a classification system in Australia of Appellation Contrôlée, but I just thought give some of the flavour and some of the history and some of the anecdotes as to where Australia's come from and to where it is today. And then we'll touch later on New Zealand. We'll do New Zealand in less detail because there'll only be 2 wines we're looking at from New Zealand and 8 from Australia. But they're very separate industries, very separate, but they are interlinked as well. And you know, we can discuss that. I think just to give it some perspective, you know, Australia is a younger country than South Africa, and the industry is younger or less old. Let's put it that way. But it is a very significant player today, and it's a more significant player internationally than South Africa is. But some dates. So 1788 was the date that the first vines were planted in Australia, in what is today Sydney. And they were planted by the first governor, whose name was Arthur Phillip. And those cuttings actually came from the Cape of Good Hope. So you know, when you mention that to people in Australia, they tend to find that irrelevant or not really interested. You know, originally the cuttings from the Cape came from France, so you know we can't really claim much fame as far as Australia is concerned.
Where did the French ones come from?
Now you're getting very philosophical. I'll let you lead on from there, Nick.
Must be, and it all starts with the Romans.
Well, the people who argue this before the Romans, but anyway. I think, you know, the 1820s and 1830s are when things started to liven up in Australia in terms of the wine industry. And a chap called Gregory Braxland was the first to export Aussie wines in 1822. And in fact, he was the first Australian producer to win an award overseas. The award system in Australia is very important, and maybe Jess can talk about that in a little while. Maybe when you're introducing one of the rare wines we discussed. Mm-hmm. And then I think an important character in the history of viticulture in Australia and actually in New Zealand is a Scotsman by the name of James Busby. And James Busby was a much travelled viticulturist, horticulturist as well, but mainly a viticulturist. And he took cuttings, he introduced some very significant cuttings into Australia, and then subsequently was the first to plant in New Zealand, and is referred to intermittently as the grandfather of Australian viticulture and of New Zealand viticulture. And he bought land in the Hunter Valley in 1924. I think he was granted 2,000 hectares, I think it was. And then a year later, he planted his first vines. And he was, I think, one of the most significant moments was the 1833 shipment of cuttings that came in on the Camden, which were planted in the Hunter. And they were the first really significant cuttings from mainly France that have subsequently spawned much of the viticulture in Australia. But by the end of the 1890s, you had very much an established and beginnings of a vibrant industry. So Hunter Valley near Sydney, Barossa near Adelaide, and Yarra near Melbourne. They were the three main ones, and then obviously everything else has gone from there. Okay, you've switched to the map. That's great. So it's a bit confusing because that's not actually a map of Australia. It's sort of bunched into the main wine regions. But the oldest, therefore, New South Wales, which is around, the various areas around Sydney. I think, the Hunter today is probably still the one with the most renown, but New South Wales wines haven't really stolen the imagination of the international markets the way that South Australia, Victoria, and Western Australia, and now Tasmania have done. They seem to be lagging, and we're not really going to talk much about New South Wales at all today, and we don't import any. I've yet to find something that really turns me on. Victoria is very much the progressive side of the industry today, and that's also now leading to other pockets within the other regions. For example, the Adelaide Hills in South Australia is very vibrant, and young Turk culture of natural wines and what have you. But Victoria, a lot of cool climate sites. South Australia is the engine ship, is the mothership of the industry in Australia, and we're going to talk about that more in detail. Western Australia, a more modern industry, but still going back a couple of generations now. Margaret River, probably the most famous from that area. And then most recently, I would say Tasmania is really coming to the fore, not least with global warming. And we'll go into Tasmania at greater length during the talk when we get to one of the wines from there. Jess, anything you want to chip in at this point?
No, that all sounds good. I'm in agreement with everything you've said so far.
Goodness me.
But a big thing for us in South Australia is pretty much, I think South Australia always draws the short straw when people are coming to visit Australia. It's not the number one destination on people's list when they're coming to visit us down under. Everyone wants to go to Sydney or go up to the beaches in Queensland. But when they do come to South Australia, it is usually because they love wine. So we're very lucky in South Australia to have 4 major wine regions pretty much within an hour of the major city, Adelaide. So to be in such close proximity to the Barossa Valley, the Adelaide Hills, McLaren Vale and the Clare Valley, we're really lucky to have such a vibrant wine community in our state.
That's a very similar situation to we have in South Africa. You've been here as well, Jess, so you will remember. It's an hour's drive to a lot of places from Cape Town. So Adelaide and Cape Town have that in common. You touched on something which is very relevant, and that is that in South Australia, because you don't have the tourism of Sydney or Melbourne, or, Queensland, the industry in South Australia, the wine industry in Australia, is very much a dominant part of the economy there. It's a major contributor to the GDP of the state and to the nation. But the other states, whether they be Victoria, New South Wales, whatever, they have other industries which are far more important to the state. Whereas wine is really, it's like the Western Cape again. The wine industry is very, very important to South Australia.
Absolutely. When I've been traveling overseas and people ask where I'm from, and they say, "You're from Sydney?" I said, "No, I'm from a small city called Adelaide." And no one's heard of Adelaide, but they have heard of the Barossa, which I always find really interesting.
So one of the things I love about traveling to the Barossa and to South Australia generally is that there is this culture of wine from father to son or to daughter, this generational respect of the land, love of the land, and love of the industry. Whereas in other regions, it's a lot younger. So like I remember 20 years ago when I first started going to the Morning Peninsula, it was very young still, and it was mainly doctors and hobbyists and weekenders and what have you. Whereas the Barossa, it's like you're not the only winery, although you are the oldest winery and family-owned winery in Australia. You're not the only winery to be on 6th generation.
No, and there's lots of grape growing families that are 6th generations. So it's very much the whole Barossa region was founded on fruit growing and grape growing. So this is sort of where it all began for us. This was where our industry started. So we have such a rich history of that farming community here, where it's multi-generational farming families that have passed on their vineyards to their daughters and sons over the years, and they've kept that going. I think the wine community is such a big part of the Barossa Valley, and everyone that we went to school with growing up was involved in wine in some way, and everyone's family has grown up, living and breathing all things Barossa wine. So it's a pretty special place in that sense. That
give us an example. So Anguston, where your winery is and your family is based, how many inhabitants are there in Anguston?
We have about 2,000 inhabitants. 2,000 is our population here in Anguston. So I think we're the 3rd biggest town in Barossa. So there's Nuriel and Nonda, which are slightly bigger, maybe 5,000 people live there. So we're a very small little town. We're a very a small community. A very close-knit community. I went to school with lots of family friends that I grew up with and that have continued to work in the wine industry as we've all grown up together, which is a really special thing. I know we're talking about Henschke later on in the mix today, and Justine and I have grown up together here in the Barossa. So now to both be 6th generation working in our family wineries and to have that friendship that we've had for such a long time is really special. And there's so many people like that in the Barossa. But if you were to visit us in Anguston, so we're in Eden Valley, the Barossa is split into the 2 zones. We've got the Barossa Valley and then Eden Valley, which is the slightly cooler climate part of the Barossa. If you were to come to our town, it's a really little winding main street with bakeries and coffee shops and a newsagent, and that's about it. We've got a beautiful pub, the Bottom Pub. We're lucky to have pubs, the Middle Pub and the Bottom Pub here in Anguston, and everyone's got their favourite watering hole. But I love walking down the street and just knowing everyone that you walk past, and it's a pretty friendly community.
The family aspect of the Barossa is very strong, and in fact in various parts of South Australia. But also, if you go back those 6 generations, there were immigrants from Europe, and a lot of them have been involved in agriculture as well previously. Exactly. There's something which fascinated me the first time I went to the Barossa, which I didn't know existed until I actually saw it, is the Barossa Deutsch influence, which is the German heritage. And a lot of the big names in the Barossa are German names. Obviously, you have the British ones as well. Your ancestors were British. But, there's a lot of German influence. And even to this day, there's still what's called Barossa Deutsch. I mean, the people...
Yeah, there's a different language. I know.
Wow.
Deutsch. They're trying to bring it back because it's slowly getting lost every generation. So they're talking about bringing it back into schools.
So it's not dissimilar to Afrikaans in that respect, and it was an imported language of European culture, and they made up their own version of it, and it still exists today. I mean, some of the growers, some of the great growers, are not very sophisticated business people, but they're people of the soil. You go and visit the vineyards with them, as I have done, and you can't believe you're in Australia. It's extraordinary.
So I have also another point or question. One thing I found fascinating, if I'm correct, is obviously this long family tradition is also reflected in the vines, which have uninterrupted been living for more than over 100 years. So it's a phylloxera-free area that allowed for today to conserve and preserve centenary vineyards, which is phenomenal. So that reflects also in that sense.
Absolutely. We talk about our old vines a lot when we're presenting Australian wine to the world, because it's such a unique part of our industry that we have these 120-year-old vines that have just sat in the ground producing incredible quality fruit for over 3 centuries. So we nickname them tricentenary vineyards because they've existed within 3 centuries, but it's a really unique part of the Australian wine industry on a broader sense. I think it's something like 13 grape varieties have their oldest vines in the world in Australia, and in the Barossa we have about 4 of them. So the oldest Shiraz vines, oldest Grenache vines, all exist in the Barossa, and we do talk about it a lot because to have survived through all these different eras and all the challenges that we've faced, all the weather, tragedies that we've had, and they weren't pulled up over the years for any reason. Someone that owned that vineyard saw how special it was and held on to it and didn't pull it up.
Jess, I'm going to jump in. In the 50s, there were a lot of vines that were grabbed up, an awful lot. And those that have survived, like Langmar, for example, they've got their Freedom Shiraz, which is, I believe, the oldest Shiraz vine in the Barossa. Is that correct?
In the world.
In the world, yeah, obviously. Sorry, excuse me. So there were quite a lot of people who were ripping up vines because the wine industry was no longer profitable.
And the government was incentivizing people to pull up their vines. So there was a whole vine pool scheme.
And some families protected them. They knew that it was their family treasure, and the Lindners, for example, they kept a huge amount of their old vines.
Yeah.
And that's part of the treasure of the Barossa today, which is. I mean, when you go and see those vines in situ, it's quite remarkable. I mean, they're trees basically, very thick, gnarly old,
bush vines
So Alex,
they don't produce a lot.
I don't know if you want to touch on history, or if you want to perhaps give an idea of Australia today, because I think that's you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so we've covered the two things two of the 4 points I wanted to cover. First was just setting the background with the history, and then involving South Australia within that context. Yeah. And then I thought I would just sort of take us for a brief trip through the reputation of Australian wines. And I'll head back to the 1920s. Between 1927 and 1939, according to the figures that are available, Australia sold more wine to the UK market than France did. There was what was called the imperial preference system in those days. But I think Australia sort of was forgotten about after that. France very much took over. The same thing happened to South African wines as well, going to the UK. And then in the 1950s, there was a bit of an awkward period in Australia. The industry had become very dominated by fortifieds, by bulk standard wines, lots of bag and box, not necessarily good bag and box, and it was failing, and a lot of vines got ripped up, and it really led to a pretty introspective time where people got out of the industry, and others decided that it had a lot more going for it and should be treated differently, and started working differently. And that led to what Rob Hill-Smith has done at Yalumba later, But I just want to give a little bit of background. I sent you both yesterday. I don't know if you looked at it. One of the sketches of Monty Python that I grew up watching and loving. I grew up in a wine family, so I was always sensitive to wine. But did you both watch that sketch, the Australian table wine sketch from 1972? Did you watch it or not?
You, Jessica?
I missed it.
Okay, well, you should read you should unjunk me from your emails. So two of my favorite quotes from that sketch, you can find it on YouTube. It's the Australian table wine sketch. My two favorite quotes, because they were deriding Australian wines. It was comical. The idea of Australia making wines in those days was comical. And the one quote was, "This bottle is one with a message in, and the message is beware," which was typical of the attitude towards Australian wines. This is worth taking seriously. And the other one is, "This is a wine for laying down and avoiding." So this was typical of the people's opinions of Australian wines. They were a joke. And within the British wine trade, certainly in my generation, that sketch is known by everybody. So I highly recommend you look at it on YouTube. It's very funny. And then the 1980s happened, and the sunshine in a glass boom that became Australian wines. And I thought I would touch on, how that actually came about, what practically brought about that change. Because what it took, in fact, because the Australian wine industry was very significant by then, but most of the wines were sold in its own market. What it was exporting still quite a bit were fortifieds and what have you. But I call it the odd bins phenomenon. That's my own term. And odd bins was in those days really the cutting edge of wine retail in the UK. They were very different than the established aspect of the industry, which was sort of very high class, people in pinstripe suits and that type of thing. And odd bins came. They were long hair. They wore t-shirts, and they just democratized wine. And they were the first to do en primeur Burgundy in 1990, for example, in the high street in the UK. It had never been done. Bordeaux, yes, but Burgundy hadn't. And they were the first people they were very rebellious in the context of the wine industry, and they brought this focus to Australia. They were the first ones to bring Australian wines to the high street in the UK. They had 100 shops at that point, and they just went nuts. And it was a phenomenal success. The industry was totally dominated by France at the time. And they had two in particular, two revolutionary leaders within the business. John Radcliffe, who ran the entire business, and then Steve Daniel, who was head of buying and marketing. And they're still, Steve Daniel's still very active in the UK wine trade today. And they brought in Ralph Steadman, the famous artist who did these crazy pictures of the wines that they selected and the wineries that they worked with that have become collector's pieces today, references. And they really put Australia on the map. And they subsequently won, having never won a Wine Merchant of the Year because it was such a staid environment, such a staid industry. They then went on to win 12 Wine Merchant of the Year in the UK, which just transformed the UK wine market. And then New World wines really became a major thing in the UK. That spread to markets around the world. And there was a generation where the wine world was turned on its head, when New World wines became really popular and became a significant player. That is changing slightly again now, where I think taste is starting to go back towards more European style wines. But odd bins really turned Australian wines into a phenomenon outside of Australia.
Alex, what were the varietals that led this phenomenon from Australia?
Shiraz and Chardonnay, very much.
And the fact that they became so popular, was it also, I mean, as far as I know, it was also a component of it was varietal labeled wines.
And they brought simplicity. They brought understandability, and they wiped away the pretense and the snobism involved traditionally in wine, and brought it to the people. And they brought it to, they made it understandable, they made it recognizable, it was good value, it was consistent. In Europe in those days before global warming as well, the change in a wine between one vintage and another was unrecognizable. Whereas the Aussie wines they were just always good. They were always reliable. They were always, had fruit. They were easy to understand. And they just ticked all these boxes that were all the, if you like, the pros and cons in European wines, with lots of pros, but the cons were they were complicated. They were unapproachable. People couldn't understand them, etc., etc. The Aussie wines just ticked all of those boxes the weaknesses of the European.
I think that consistency is a very good point, because I think it's always been one of the synonyms with Australian wines, of consistency and quality, and it's quite an interesting.
And the European wine industry was very fragmented, and the Australians very quickly brought brands and were able to link into the market at a point where the supermarkets were becoming bigger and bigger players during the 80s and 90s. And so those two, their market share grew, hand in hand. And that also led to, I think, part of the problem today with the reputation of Australia is that people think of it too much as, and Jess, I'm sure you'll talk about it as well. It's like pigeonholed into the sunshine in the glass supermarket wines.
It's a reputation we share, I think.
We did such a good job of that campaign that it's stuck with us ever since.
So, the odd bins phenomenon. Then also they did the same thing with us with New Zealand, and in fact, in 1996, they did a very major focus on South African wines, which again brought a lot of the independence, because South Africa category in the UK was very much dominated by the big brands, the Stell brands, whatever. And a bunch of made-up brands like Kamala and what have you, which were very successful. But Oddbins brought really the first major portfolio of South African estate wines and smaller producers as well in 1996. Early 90s. And then in 1996, one of the things that I watched, I've always respected how much the Australian industry is professional, how they put a lot of money into research. They have some of the finest research institutions in the world, both in terms of viticulture, winemaking, diseases, market research, all levels of the industry. And they've mapped it out to what the population is, what the consumption is, how many scientists they need per capita, and they've planned the education around that, and they built this incredible industry. And they created a document, which is an industry document in 1996, which is called Vision 2020, and they gave themselves 24 years to reach these goals, which were highly ambitious goals, which seemed improbable. And they reached those goals. It was all export focused. They reached those goals in 7 years. So by 2003, they had hit those targets they'd given themselves 24 years to reach. So it was a machine. It really was. And I have a profound respect for the Australian wine industry.
Well, how much the institution?
Just got a special guest.
Oh, look at this. One of the legends.
He's taking a seat with me.
Here we go.
Just for a minute.
This is Jess's dad. This is Robert Hill-Smith. How are you doing, Rob? Nice to see you.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everybody.
So we've got 43 people watching us now.
Hello, everybody. And good morning, wherever you are.
Is this your first Zoom? Hey, get off, turn your video off.
She's too shy to switch the video on.
Luce won't turn the video on.
Oh, okay.
Abby, turn off the video, please. Thank you.
There you go.
Ah, look. There's daughter number 2. Come back on, Lucy.
It's a family affair.
So that's Lucy Hill-Smith calling in from London.
And there's Abby in between.
Yeah, Abby, turn yours. Abby's from Radford Dale. Lucy, good to see you. We got 3 members of the Hill-Smith family. Wow, what a treat. So, Rob.
So, what are we talking about, Alex?
Alex is just a bit of an overview over.
I just sort of given a bit of background on the history of wine from Australia, the industry, and we were just coming into really the modern era, and we're about to talk about Yalumba. So maybe we should just cut what I was about to say and go into Yalumba, seeing as you're there. We do that, Nick?
Absolutely.
So all these stats and what have you on the slide, you can everybody who's watching this can read later because they'll have the presentation. But so Yalumba is a unique phenomenon in the wine industry in Australia. It's globally significant, but it really, I think, the thing about Yalumba is it very much reflects the history of the Barossa and the Australian wine industry, and the values of the Australian wine industry, and particularly South Australia. And it's one of those beautiful companies that has succeeded in being successful and remaining family owned. It is the oldest family owned winery in Australia, 1849. It was created by Rob's, great grandfather, or Samuel Smith, from Dorset in England. So not one of the Silesians or Germans that populated the Barossa.
No doubt.
And it's remained in family hands ever since, direct descendants. And Rob, you took over when you were what, 34?
Yep, 34 on the.
So about 50 years ago, Rob took over. And you consolidated what, you know, the business was very much a family business, but different branches and different members of the family. You consolidated it into your immediate family, and you've directed the business, you know, in an era where, you know, Australia was still very much fortifieds and bulk wines. You've really taken it upstream. You've focused on provenance. You've focused on premium. You've focused on the, you know, the great qualities of the South of I was going to say South Australian, but the Australian wine industry. And you've created this incredible collection of family estates and companies, and also representing other top producers from Australia, whose wines you sell around the planet, with your Negociants International Distribution Company. You were one of the first people to invest in Tasmania significantly, both for sparkling wine, but also Pinot as well in particular. So you own Jantz and Dalrymple. In New Zealand, you invested long time ago in New Zealand. You own Nautilus, amongst a few other things. You brought skills into the company to be able to have your own dedicated cooperage, and you have the second most significant nursery for vineyards in Australia, which is awesome. So, what haven't you managed to achieve so far?
The dream keeps moving, Alex. But oh well, this is not a time. This is a time right now to be bunkering down, not dreaming too much. It's a bit like when we started after the buyout of the family, and when it was Monday, we'd plan to get to Friday, and when it was Friday, we'd plan to get to Monday. So we're back where we started from in the 80s. But anyway, we are happy with what we've got. We've got beautiful vineyard assets, and we've just finished a difficult and challenging vintage or harvest, but we're very happy with the wines. Very happy. But it's been a tough year for everybody in the game, wherever you're
referring to the fires as well as COVID-19, I presume.
Yeah, the only thing we haven't had is locusts, but they might. It doesn't matter if they come now; they can come, but they haven't been with us. But we've had frost, we've had bushfires, a windy set, a winter drought, and a dry spring. But the vine is a very resilient plant, as we've found out many times. And if you work with it.
Tell me, the first families of wine
that
you were part of setting up. Can you just fill us in quickly about that, because it's quite relevant to the history of the industry in Australia. You've got 1,400 years between you in terms of winemaking experience.
Yeah. Well, it really was born out of, we felt, a grey era where, you know, things were on a roll, the economies around the world were strong, and the wine industry had gone from being the wine world had gone from being quite independent and collaborative to being quite corporatized, and the messages were being lost in the corporate space rather than in the viticultural space. So we felt there was a need to bring the idea back to the vineyard and to the families that were founder families of our wine world. And so we formed a group to basically be travellers or ambassadors for our own brands, but ambassadors for our country, and bringing what we call, colour and soul and character back into the message about what we do and how we look at what we do. And so we did that in 2009 formally. And, now we have, well, there were 12. We're now 11. And hopefully if McWilliams prevail, there will still be 11. But if they can't prevail, there'll only be 10, sadly. But it's been a very beneficial concept and idea. And it's brought families with, as you said, 1,400 years of winemaking history closer together. And fortuitously, I think, another generation into our family businesses as well, or family winery farms, such as the lady next to me, who maybe was thinking of careers elsewhere, but because of first families, I think, as in other family cases, has seen the light and come in to join us.
Alex, I was going to the first family's story really followed on from what you were just talking about, with Australia's messaging being around sunshine in the glass and being sort of a commercial experience. So easy drinking, don't take it too seriously, just drink Australian Shiraz or Australian Chardonnay. All the beauty of regionality and terroir was really getting lost. So this is what I think all these old family-owned wineries really hated, seeing those messages. All their hard years of work and multi-generational family business was just getting lumped into this Australian identity, and it was
generic.
Yeah.
We had the same issue here. Chenin Blanc and Pinotage with animal labels and crazy African names being, moved around the planet and sold in supermarkets at dirt cheap prices, gave South Africa a very bad name, and that's given rise to a counter reaction to that, which is a lot of the young Turk producers and independents of today who are leading the voice. So not dissimilar to what you do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the vision was that 12 voices was stronger than one, and the reality was that all of us were traveling around the world individually, trying to promote our individual family-owned businesses and trying to tell the story of where we've come from and where we've got to. And that message was delivered a lot louder and stronger when there was 12 of us presenting our family-owned wineries as one.
Is it related in any way, or is there any collaboration with Primum Familia Vini, or is it completely separate organization? Is there any
completely independent? Yeah, it's a it's a Piazza. Somewhat inspired by, I think. We were aware of it. In fact, Rosemount was invited into the PFV as the first maybe after Mondavi. So within the PFV, there was Mondavi and there was Rosemount. And in fact, they had a collaboration, which might explain.
The PFV, for our viewers, is the organisation in Europe of the first families of European wines, essentially.
Yeah. And it might have been inspired by them. I don't recall it completely, but we've been a little more active, I think, and more engaging than the PFV. Not that we don't have a lot of good friends within the PFV.
And you import a lot of their wines into Australia.
Wines. I think we import 10 of the 12 members of the PFV.
So you were aware.
But Ross Brown, interesting, Nicolò. Ross Brown came up with a definition or a saying that our first families is all about co-opetition. So we're still all in competition with one another, but we have a lot of cooperation, not collusion, but cooperation. So
competition.
It's itself in a lot of ways, sharing information about research and viticulture, winemaking, barrel aging and construction, just in general, it's been very beneficial across a lot of spaces in what we do.
Can I ask you a question, Rob, and Jess, for that matter? When people ask me what are Australia's two most well-suited varieties or most famous varieties or whatever, I tend to, if we're limited to two, I would respond Shiraz and Riesling, but that doesn't take into account regionality. Things like Viognier that you've pioneered in certain areas, or Pinot Noir in core areas, Chardonnay, Cab, etc. What do you think really brings credit to Australia in terms of varieties?
Well, if you talk about variety, then you've got to accept the diversity of styles across that varietal offering. So, when you go from the southwest of Western Australia, which is southwest of Australia, in Western Australia, around Margaret River, all the way to, if we put the Hunter Valley into it in New South Wales, it's a massive geographical area.
It's a 5-hour flight across.
So, you know, we've hung our hat over the years probably on Shiraz as being the variety that is attributed to Australia. And for a long time it was seen, you know, I suppose through the 90s, through that sort of ascendancy of Australia into global markets, it was seen to be a bit of a one-trick pony. But I think, you know, all the varietals that we all embrace show amazing diversity across regions of the country. And I think even within regions now, as is the norm in other European spaces, you are seeing diversity within region. And I think that's the beauty of what we do. There is no homogenous offering from either a region by variety or a country by variety. It all gets down to the place and the artistic stroke. So I think there's no one. I think you could generalize about anything and get away with it, but I think Cabernet showcases regionality pretty expressively. If you look at the difference between Coonawarra and Margaret River, and you look at, you know, Chardonnay from the south of Tasmania to Chardonnay that Tyrrells produce in the Hunter Valley, you know, it's definitively varietal, but you certainly have a very distinct thumbprint on the from a regional perspective. It's a bit like dialects of English or whatever the language might be. You can
very good analogy.
You can pick a Queenslander's accent very easily from a Victorian's accent, and it's probably the same as Britain or South Africa for that matter. Maybe Italy.
Definitely Italy.
Cool. Well, so I hope that answers your question.
It does, and
yeah.
You know, I think in Australian wines in South Africa tend to have a very difficult time. It's a real uphill struggle trying to sell them, which brings me on to the next point, and that is that we have this. You're aware of this. We have this absurd situation in South Africa where we have a 25% import tax on non-EU wines. To be accurate, it's refundable on EU wines, but it's not on Australian or non-EU wines. So we're penalised by 25% on top of VAT, on top of excise and whatever. So it's difficult. Jess and I were talking before we came on air about how both in Australia and in South Africa, you know, at the top end of the market, people, if they're not buying local, they'll buy French, they'll buy European. You know, it's very difficult. I come to Australia regularly, as you know, and selling premium South African wines in Australia is very difficult. Like selling premium Australian wines in South Africa is very difficult. Mm-hmm. But you've worked with us. You and your team have worked with us. You've enabled us to not get around the tax, but you're our only supplier in the world that invoices us in rands, and you guarantee us a rand price for the year, which is, I don't know how you do it, but thank you for that. And
just take it on the chin, Alex. We'll just take it on the chin.
Well, I know you do, but I'm thanking you publicly for that. And you give us incredible pricing for reasons best known to yourself. So we're able to remain competitive with your wines in this market. And Nick said at the beginning of this, in fact, before we went on air, that our portfolio of Aussie and Kiwi wines is really the only active portfolio in South Africa. And you don't really see many other wines other than ours.
Yeah. So, we respect that. Thank you.
So we should actually get on to the wines now, the wines that we've selected. I've selected 10 wines. It's from 8 different wineries. There are 3 from Yalumba, because I'm very biased and because I think South Africa needs to know them better. This is Yalumba on screen at the moment. Can you see that, Rob? Jess?
Yes, sir. It's a sunny day. Not right now. It's raining cats and dogs, thank goodness.
But this is where we are.
So Rob's office is the one obscured by the barrels there in the bottom left-hand corner.
That is my office, yes.
That's seat 1A.
Tell us about this building.
Oh, okay. Well, this building was built at the turn of the 20th century. I believe 1895, built between, it took several years to finish, 1895 to 1895 to 1905. it basically encased or ring fenced the older winery, which would have been just probably a shed with some galvanized iron roofing and sides. It's hard to imagine. There's not a lot of photographic
You had a picture
archive.
of something before.
Yeah, wait, I can go back. Here, no.
That is not the winery.
Oh,
no.
okay.
Thank you, Jim. But anyway, it was built during my great-grandfather and my grandfather's era out of local stone. So some of the stone was quarried off our own property because basically we sit on a ridge, a very long ridge, by the way, that runs many miles. But a ridge
sandstone,
of
right, Rob?
Pardon?
It's sandstone. Ironstone.
No, marble, blue marble.
Oh, wow.
Marble and limestone. So it looks quite sandy there, but it is a bit darker. But it is limestone and marble. In fact, there's no slab, there's no base on the winery. It's actually built. I mean, I fear for it, but it is built on the dirt, which is marble. So it's all stone based, but no formalized slab. So it's built, we'd call it with a strong European nod or British tradition. Looks more like an English public school than a winery, but whatever reason, there were several of these built of this style in the Barossa, Seppeltsfield being one, Chateau Tanunda being another. So it's rather grand. And behind it, of course, sits the winery and all the other activities that we undertake, storage, bottling, wood maturation, etc. So that is it.
Chateau Tanunda is owned by a South African, isn't it?
John Gieber owns Chateau Tanunda.
Yeah. So one of the things I love about coming to Yalumba is Rob is very great with the details of people visiting, and that flag that you see above the clock tower is always there's always hoisted a South African flag when I come to visit, which is
yes.
Very touching. I always admire your
below the Australian flag, which is good.
Yeah.
We have an Italian.
Yes, we acknowledge.
There you go.
You've come a long way. It's a nice gentle recognition of the journey.
There you go. Let's get into the wines, Nick.
Yes, Alex, thank you so much. So,
Nick, can I just butt in? And
sure.
Alex, may I just interrupt? Thank you for letting me join in, and I hope you enjoy the taste. I'm going to butt out now and let the next generation handle the more delicate aspects of this tasting, but I hope it goes well and everybody enjoys it. And I see that you're drinking, or tasting, I should say, the Tricentenary Grenache, one of my all-time wines.
Actually, it's not a tasting, it's a presentation.
I know, all right. The Pusey Vale Estate Riesling, okay.
Bringing this.
61 block, even better.
Yeah.
All right. Well, happy tasting, everybody. Okay. Happy tasting. Thank you again, Alex. And
cheers.
Thank you, Nick.
Keep well.
Ciao.
I hope you can visit one day soon when we're allowed again.
Well, that was unscripted. That was delightful. Thanks for, I don't know if you organised that, Jess, or whether Rob just popped in, but that's fantastic.
I can be persuasive.
Very cool. All right, so let's get stuck into to the wines.
So, Alex, before you get going, I just want to reiterate the way our product pages are laid out, and obviously there is your notes that you personally wrote about these wines. So you had a tough job of reviewing and opening a bottle of each of them and having to review them. You wrote your personal notes, and just below that we indicate the amount of bottles that are available in the country at the moment. So I just want to reiterate, if you would like some of these wines, please DM me, write me a private note, and I'll make a note and we'll process it later. As you can see, and there are 6 bottles available, so it's fairly rare. So, Alex, over to you. Thank you.
I might have 6 more hidden. I do actually, but it's got my name on it. But if anybody specifically wants it, then I can do so. So we just mentioned earlier about the incredible tradition of old vines. And this is a vine which goes back to 1889. It's in the heart of the Barossa. very small. I mean, 820 vines actually remaining. So I can't imagine you make more than a couple of tons of this. Do you know what your production is of this?
I know it's about 5,000 bottles.
As much as that? Wow, it's still yielding nicely. That's impressive.
Yeah, these Grenache vines actually yield quite well. It's more about crop management, so we have to maintain what we're producing to ensure that.
Amazing, a vine that's 130 years old and you have to do crop management still.
130 years old. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I love this wine. Grenache is often in the Barossa. Grenache is sort of second fiddle to Shiraz. It's often used as a blending component. You get a lot of Shiraz Grenache or Shiraz Grenache Mataro, as you call it there, which is Mourvèdre here. But there's some very good single varietal Grenaches in the Barossa and actually in South Australia, because McLaren Vale makes some fantastic Grenache as well. People like Steve Fennell and Darren Berg who are making fantastic. But in the Barossa, you've got people like John Duval, who was the former head winemaker of Penfolds Grange, and then Yalumba with the Tricentenary. For me, I actually quite often prefer, even though it's less famous than some of those perhaps, I prefer drinking the Yalumba, but I really do, because I find that, which is quite faithful to the philosophy at Yalumba, is that the wines have more restraint. A lot of the Grenaches, it's a hot climate there, are very ripe, very rich, very heavy, alcoholic, and almost sweet. The thing I love about this Tricentenary Grenache is it still has freshness. It's still balanced. And any wine that you can't drink a bottle of on your own, you're wasting your time in my book. And this is one of those absolutely fantastic Grenaches that you can really enjoy. I like to chill it a little bit. Not like a Gamay perhaps, but it's a cracking wine. Unfortunately, we get a very small allocation. I think we got 18 or 24 bottles for the whole country, for the whole year. But it's a knockout. It really is.
So, Alex,
we do love our Grenache.
I know you mentioned consistency on Australia, but can you tell me something about the 2015 vintage specifically? Because it was extraordinary here, it was extraordinary in Europe. Is it the same in Australia?
Well, Jess, you're best qualified to talk about 2015.
Okay.
So the question was, how was the vintage in Australia and in your area?
So vintages for me, I always have to just double check my notes because I don't want to get it wrong, and I know it's important.
Okay, well, 2015 was a very, generally speaking, was a good vintage. I think it was planetarily. It was one of those vintages that sort of made itself to a degree. And I think, one of the vintages we're getting onto in the next two wines, actually 2012, are wines with more restraint. The 2015s are very friendly. They've got great fruit expression, but they tend to have this sort of like all-rounder character to them. They're sort of pretty easygoing wines and difficult to get wrong.
Yeah, I'm just checking the notes, and this does ring true for how fantastic all our 15 vintages have been, but it's a long and mild summer with very few heat spikes, which is quite rare for us. We usually at the end of December and January, February, we can very commonly have 2 weeks of 40 degrees plus. So obviously this was a summer where we didn't get those high extremes, and incredibly cool nights that helped retain that acidity and pristine fruit flavors. So that to me sounds like a pretty perfect vintage when you're talking about Barossa Reds. To have cool nights is so important to us, and this is what we've been so lucky to have in this vintage. We did have some extreme heat waves in 2020, along with bushfires, but we've had very early cool nights, so this has been a good thing for us. So that's what we look for, those cool nights and mild summers.
So, this is a piece of history. There isn't a single wine in South Africa I'm aware of that is from a vine that is 130 years old. So if you take everything into account, you take into account our currency, you take into account the 25% import tax, and you've got this historic wine at that level of pricing, it's extraordinary. And it's a great
Bottled history.
We're
very lucky.
You don't need to convince anymore because they're all gone. So they're all sold. So if you want them now, it's too late. So I have a question about this. Sorry, but because just Alex, just explain me such an old vine. What type of fruit does it produce? I mean, it's incredibly concentrated, is it?
You tend to get. I mean, I've just been contradicted a little bit because of the levels that they're still managing production, which is amazing. But in old vines, you tend to get much less bunches, and you tend to get much smaller berries, more concentration, more intensity, and those vines tend to make wines which have great ageability, but in small production.
And also, is it correct in saying that the roots are obviously, being an older plant, to go much deeper?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the soil types that you have and the, other factors. But I've seen in the Barossa, I was at a friend's place when they pulled up an old Shiraz vine, and it was like a tree growing under the surface in terms of the root systems. It was really impressive.
And that's true of this vineyard too. So this particular site, it's in a sub-region called Vine Vale, and it's incredibly sandy, free-draining soils. So this is why I think these vines have been able to survive for so long. They're all dry grown. There's no irrigation on these vineyards. So it's such a testament to the variety being planted in these perfect conditions, that it's just been able to survive for so long and consistently produce outstanding quality fruit.
One of the reasons I selected this wine, and you asked me to select 10 wines, 2 from New Zealand, 8 from Australia, and in terms of the relevance of the history of the Barossa within the Australian industry, for me, we had to have an old vine, and this Tri-Century Grenache sort of like sums up all of that culture of the Barossa into this wine, and it's very special. It really is.
I have a question from Lorraine, who asks, such an old vine, low yielding, and you produce only 5,000 bottles. Why does it come for such good value? You could clearly price this much higher. Is it?
Before Jess answers, and you'll see it in the next wine as well, the signature, is one of the things I love about the Yalumba ethos is its value for money. It doesn't matter which segment of the market they produce in, they give tremendous value for money, and that's very much a trait that I love in the top European producers that we work with as well. They're not looking at marketing or just pricing, based on speculation or what have you. They over-deliver. And sometimes that's been to their detriment at Yalumba, because you have other newcomers which are much more expensive and get all the press, and people maybe pass by the Yalumba wine sometimes because they're so established. But they bring quality and value for money, and I think that's very important.
So Lorraine also made a nice note, an anecdote, is that this vineyard has been planted, and she says Barossa has yet to see phylloxera, but this vineyard was planted 1 year before phylloxera hit. So it's quite a significant symbolic vineyard for sure.
Yes, do you want to comment on why you don't price your wines higher?
I'd say you're completely right. It's a family philosophy, and Dad has always been so firm on the fact he doesn't want people, he wants people to be able to drink our wines, and he wants anybody to be able to find wine at any price point. So whatever we are making at Yalumba, we always ensure that over delivers on what you're paying. So any bottle of Yalumba wine that you drink, you're to get more than what your dollar is paying for.
I have the same philosophy, and that's often worked against me for the exact same reasons. So I understand.
So for this wine and the signature particularly, I'm so often told that why isn't it more expensive? It's got this incredible history and the story and the heritage, but the reality is that we want anyone in the world, to be able to experience these wines. So that's something that will not change for us.
So moving on to the signature, this is probably the Yalumba wine that I drink the most of. Red wine, that is. Pusey Vale Riesling is the wine. But for me, this is it's a fabulous testament to the values, the Hillsmith values and Yalumba, and that you every year or every vintage of the signature, is dedicated to somebody who is important to the winery, whether they be an employee or a grower or somebody important, in the industry. You recognize individuals, and each vintage or each signatory has their story explained on the label, as you can see. And I know that this has been going on since 1962. I think it was your grandfather who started at Wyndham, carried on by your father, and obviously into this generation as well. And I remember the 2012 vintage. So 2012 was a fantastic vintage in the Barossa. It was a great wine. And so there was a little bit of a conspiracy that brewed behind the scenes, because your father was trying to take a backseat, moving away from the managing directorship to the chairmanship. And so somebody else's name was fed into the system for those that needed to know who the signatory was. And a surprise was pulled on your dad, and the amazing 2012 vintage, he is the signatory. So to his surprise at the ceremony.
Yeah, exactly. So it is one of the most important traditions that we have at Yalumba, where every year at our Christmas party, the whole business is gathering on the lawns. It's usually a beautiful sunny day. We've cooked a barbecue and we're all in fancy dress, and we just have a big long lunch all together. And the ultimate part of the day is when the signatory is announced. So this is a tradition we've had for over 46 releases of this wine. So we have been celebrating signatories since 1962. So that wine was released 4 years later in 66. And in that year, it was our Prime Minister at the time declared that Yalumba Dry Claret, so it was the Cabernet Shiraz wine, which at the time was called Yalumba Reserve Claret. The Prime Minister announced that this was the finest red wine he had tasted in Australia. And so my grandfather took that accolade and saw that as an opportunity to relaunch the wine. And he thought, I think we'll relaunch the wine and dedicate the wine to our founder, Samuel Smith, a dedication to where we've come from. And he put his signature on the front of the label. And that launched the signature and the tradition of every year the wine is released to dedicate it to someone in our business. So over the years, we've had, as Alex has said, various different characters from within our business receive the ultimate accolade of the signatory. And this particular year, 2012, it was not announced at the Christmas party. My uncle took the reins and had a little secret committee that colluded to announce the signatory a few months before our Christmas party, because it was seen to be Dad's year. So 2012 was the year that Dad received his signature on the back label. So his story of his time at Yalumba and his life at Yalumba on the back label, his signature on the front. So we all met at Dad's favourite restaurant in Adelaide, which is an Italian restaurant called Chianti. And it was on his birthday, so we had just said we're having a family dinner at Chianti, and he met us there. And he went upstairs into the private dining room, and we had gathered all the past signatories that had received their name on the bottle over the years, and some very dear friends from the winery and his best friends all were there, and he was surprised with name getting on the bottle that year. So it was a big celebration and a big surprise.
So and it was a great vintage.
When does Alex get his signature?
No, that'd be ridiculous. Again, I put this in here and it's relevant. I usually buy 120 bottles of the signature. And as soon as I knew it was your dad, before it was released, I put my hand up for 600 bottles. So I bought a lot of that.
Also a spectacular vintage, apart from the beautiful story. I think we don't mention ratings anywhere because we want to be completely, authentic in this presentation. But I believe this one scored like 96 and 97 points. Is it correct, Alex?
Look at the message from Lucy Hill Smith.
Yeah.
You've seen his face. I have no idea what the points were, but it always scores ridiculously highly. Yes.
Yeah, I think on the website.
So if you know my father, or if you could tell from then, he's an absolute control freak with things. So for something like this to have snuck under his nose, he was well and truly surprised. So it was amazing. But yeah.
The other thing I love about this wine is that it is the Barossa blend. So one always refers to Shiraz, but if you go to Angus and you go to the Barossa itself, the historic blend, the cultural blend there is Cab Shiraz, and the signature is always Cab Shiraz in that order, if I'm not mistaken. And correct me if I'm wrong. The Cab is from Coonawarra and the Shiraz is from the Barossa.
So that will be our next wine. The Kaylee is.
Yeah. So this is purely Barossa. Sorry, I got the two confused. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the signature is all about Barossa.
But in terms of when you say blend, the red blend in the Barossa, it's really Cab Shiraz, right?
Yeah, exactly. So these were called Barossa blends or clarets back in the day. So when everyone recognized it as a claret, and I'd love to be able to bring that terminology back because it's such a way to describe a full-bodied red, a claret. So this is our Cabernet Shiraz. So this is something that has been nicknamed the Great Australian Red by a writer in the UK called Matthew Jukes. So he's run a competition in Australia for about 12 years now, where he comes over every year and looks at a lineup of Cabernet Shiraz wines by every producer from every region. And he absolutely fell in love with the blend and saw that it was something really unique that Australia was really championing. There's obviously other regions around the world that make Cabernet Shiraz, including yourself, Alex. But in terms of something that we really hang our hat on as uniquely Australian, this is a very unique Australian blend. So the Great Australian Red competition has been running for a long time, and we've always been very well awarded in those blind tastings.
I also just on a personal note want to add that we have been selling this wine, I think, for a year or two now, and sorry, there's a fly, and it's amazing how everyone that tries it has such an incredible response to this, because it's truly a spectacular blend. It comes with a great price, super highly rated, and it's probably one of the best pairing with a rye, which is our local barbecue.
Absolutely.
So every single person that orders it, reorders it. So that's quite, for me, quite remarkable. So I recommend everyone to try it. And drink now.
And if you do see
and Alex, how long would you recommend aging this wine, if at all?
I've had vintage. I've been very lucky to have vintages, very old vintages, with Rob in Australia in Yalumba and in his house. I've seen the old labels that they said claret on them. If you go into the family museum collection at your winery, you can see those old labels. But don't bring that back. Claret's a French term. Well, it's a British term for French wine, for Bordeaux. Sorry. Don't go back there. That was one of the points I was going to touch on earlier before Rob Zoom bombed us, is that Australia for an era had a lot of French names on their wines. They put things like Burgundy and Beaujolais and Chablis on their wines.
We had Rhine Rieslings.
Yeah, and that stopped pretty much in the 80s, thankfully, because the EU took Australia to task on it, and there was a big negotiation between the two governments, rather like we had in South Africa as well. And I was actually personally involved in that. I was living in Burgundy at the time, and Burgundy was the major region affected by that because they were using a lot of Burgundian names. They even said things like champagne as well. But so because I was English speaking, I was the translator between the lawyers I think they were in Melbourne, if I remember correctly, and the BIVB in Burgundy, to try and negotiate a settlement rather than going through litigation. And I remember I was only 21 or 22, something like that, and I said to the lawyer in Australia, I don't understand why using French names. Use your own identity, and it's the greatest thing that you have. And Australia today, I mean, you don't see those French names anymore at all in the overseas markets, and it basically disappeared in Australia. And very much to Australia's credit, your own identity rules. Which brings us on to the next one.
So your flagship, is this correct to say that's your flagship wine in the range?
Yeah, this is the pinnacle of our collection.
And also links into a previous 3 generations ago to one of your family members.
Exactly. There's always a story with these wines.
You wanna tell us about that?
So I've got a physical example here. I'm not going to open it tonight because it's a little bit special for a Wednesday night.
We're not worthy. Thanks. Good. Well done,
No,
Jess.
share it with me. But this wine was first released in 2012.
Lucy says, "Open it, Jess."
She would. So we were just talking about how incredible the 2012 vintage was for that within South Australia. And during the classification of our wines that year, there were 2 parcels of fruit that kept standing out on the tasting bench when Dad and our winemaker, Brian Walsh, were classifying the barrels and where they were which wine they were destined for. And there was 2 parcels of fruit. One was a Coonawarra Cabernet and the second was a Barossa Shiraz. And on the tasting bench, both of these parcels kept standing out as outstanding, beyond anything that we had a home for at the time. And it gave Dad the idea, or perhaps the confidence, that perhaps it was time to release a new wine. It had been a long time for us since we had launched a new wine in our rare and fine collection, and I think it's not something that we do very often. And this was, I think the 2012 vintage was just the opportunity to really challenge ourselves as winemakers and look at creating or making the best wine we possibly could using a Cabernet Shiraz blend. We hadn't ever done a Coonawarra and Barossa blend before, so this was something new for us to work with. But the wine was blended up and it was left alone for about 2 years in the cellars before it sort of came to light, and Dad started thinking about what the story and the name for this wine would be. And he came across the story of one of his ancestors, his great uncle, Fred Cayley Smith. And Fred was in the second generation of our Hill Smith family. And Fred was the eldest son of his generation. And back in those days, the eldest son was really, the heir to the business. He was destined to take over and run the family business. But Fred was not interested in that, running the business. He was a horticulturist by trade and an adventurous soul. And he wanted to go and travel around the world and share the story of Yalumba and learn about what was happening in different cultures and countries around the world. So Fred set off on a journey all around the world to learn about what was going on. And every day he was traveling, he wrote home letters to his father, sort of, I think, to prove that he wasn't just having a jolly good time and traveling around the world and living it up. So he was writing home detailed letters about things he was learning the whole time through his 18-month journey. And these letters were long gone. We didn't know they existed, and we didn't know the story of Fred Cayley Smith. But in the Clock Tower building, there is a staircase that goes right up the top so we can change the flag when our special guests come to visit. And in that staircase, there was sort of stairs were falling down, and we had to fix it up and move the staircase. And underneath that staircase, we found this box of old letters that Fred had been writing back to his father. And Dad heard about this story and thought, well, I think I've got a name for my wine. We'll dedicate this wine to Fred Cayley Smith, whose work this is 1893 that he was traveling around the world, so about 130 years ago now. And we think that all his learnings and things that he picked up along the way were so important to where we ended up as a business. And so this wine is dedicated to Fred, our adventurous son.
So interestingly, if I can butt in there, two things. First of all, whilst he was traveling around Europe, the tricentenary Grenache was probably producing its first fruit.
Exactly, yes.
And then secondly, he brought back a lot of cuttings with him.
Exactly. Smuggled them in. Vine cuttings and fruit cuttings.
And those were then propagated and then created a lot of the plantings subsequently.
Exactly. So he was incredibly important to our history. And to have all these letters of things that he was discovering has been, like, I have been loving reading the stories and reading his letters. He was quite poetic. But the 2012 was the first release, and they do come beautifully packaged, but in every box you see there is a bottle that's been wrapped up, which is a map which traces his journey. And every booklet in here sort of takes extracts from his letters and focuses on part of his journey. So we start his journey in San Francisco, and he writes about, you know, going to opium dens and all these sorts of things, which we don't publish publicly. But it was a really incredible journey. So every release of this wine, we've now released a 2013 and 14 as well. But the 2012 was certainly one of the most exciting releases in Yalumba's history. And certainly the sentiment from the wine world was, it's about time Yalumba made a wine like this.
So it's one of Australia's icon wines.
So and we got 12 bottles, and that was it.
Yeah. So we don't make a lot of it, as you can imagine. And it's an extra special wine, and it really is built for the cellar. This wine, we know with our history of making Cabernet Shiraz at Yalumba, we know how long they last and how well these wines cellar. But I have been lucky to taste these wines quite a lot since I've been home at various tastings and events, and they do drink beautifully as young wines. So they're released as a 5-year-old already, so they do have that bottle age on release, but they last the test of time.
Amazing.
We'd comfortably say 30 plus years for these wines in the cellar.
Cool. Nick.
Alex.
Oh, before we move on, last thing.
Yeah.
Because it just reminds me, having the name on the label, your ancestor, your great uncle. One of the things that I love about going to Yalumba is when you walk into the clock tower building, on your left hand side, there's a wall full of names. On those oak panels, it reminds me going to back to boarding school with the captain's name. Do you want to just tell us what those names are and why they're on the? So
there's 2 panels. There's our VSOPs, so these are people that have worked for our business for a very long time, and then our VSOGs, so our very special old growers. So there's 2 panels there that are dedicated to people that have been with our family for a long time. And I think one of the really special things which we touched on before in the Barossa is our growing community. And I think we don't talk about them enough, because we do have estate-owned vineyards, but our growers in the Barossa play such an important role in our winemaking.
From generation to generation as well.
Multi-generation. And I've met all of our growers recently, and they tell me stories about remembering coming to drop off grapes with their grandfather by horse and cart. And you just think that just puts in perspective how long this business has been going and how strong those ties are. Someone asked me the other day what sort of contracts we have with our growers, and I had to laugh because we just have handshake agreements with our old friends that they're just standing friendships really, and an agreement that we'll look after each other. So that's our VSOPs, our very special old growers, and VSOPs, the people in our business who have worked for us for over 21 years. So there is a very long list of people in our winery, in our family business, who have worked for a very long time. And I think that I took it for granted, but people say it to me every time they visit Yalumba. They can feel that sense of pride and the love and that family feel around the winery when they walk around.
What's nice about it is that a lot of those names are repeated through the history of that board. You can see the same names, so generations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention that. It's really unique part of Yalumba's history. Nick, back to you.
Yeah, I think just go to this picture, because it's something that's just obviously it's mind-boggling. When I saw it the first time, I said, I actually cannot believe it. And this is nice because obviously family values is one very big silver lining in this conversation, but also these old vines. I mean, I keep on going back there. It's just insane. I mean, look at this. And Alex, I think you can introduce the next wine, which is also another one of the icons of Australian winemaking. So
I think let me just talk very, very succinctly about Eden Valley, because if you look at it on a page in a book, you can see it's strictly speaking, it's part of the Barossa. but it's actually very unique. Yeah, go back if you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where, I can't really, even with my glasses on. Oh yeah, there, right, okay, right. Well, it doesn't really distinguish it, but it's, I mean, Yalumba's on Eden Valley Road as you exit Anguston, and it's about a 10-12 minute drive up the hill to Eden Valley itself, to the little village. And it's like going from Somerset West to Elgin. I mean, perhaps not quite as steep, but in terms of climatic change. So you go from, you know, the valley floor in Barossa, which is about 250 meters, to Pusey Vale it's the highest vineyard up in Elgin, in Eden Valley, and that averages 500 meters above sea level, and it's much, much cooler there. I mean, in the winter time, it's completely white, it's totally frosted over, and it's a very, very different feel to Eden Valley. It's very famous for Riesling. You know, there are other areas in Australia like Clare Valley which also make Riesling, but for me, my personal favourites are from Eden Valley. I have that sentimental attachment to it because I have a lot of friends there. But this vineyard, which we're going on to the next slide, I think, Nick, is Pusey Vale.
No.
So Pusey Vale. Oh no! Whoops, we're going to Hill of Grace.
This is the Hill of Grace.
Okay, so right. Let's talk about Henschke in that case. For some reason, I thought it was the Pusey Vale first and then the Henschke. But the Henschke, I think Henschke is probably the, for want of a better word, estate wine, although that has a different significance in Australia. But the family-owned winery that is probably the most high-profile internationally, the most famous wine. The Hill of Grace is really legendary, as it is in Australia. You know, in the Langton's classification, which is sort of the referred to classification of the top Australian wines, it's second only to Penfolds Grange, but it's the only family-owned winery in Australia to have 2 wines in the top classification, which is exceptional. And they are, like Jess and her family, now into their 6th generation as well. And you know, that's the whole of history there. They originated from Silesia, which is now southern Poland, but they came to Australia and also in the 1860s, and it's founded. And in fact, the Hill of Grace's name came from one of the first members of the family who donated a plot of land to the church up in Eden Valley, and the church, the name in German translation, I've got it in my notes, but the church's name translated into English is Hill of Grace, and so that's the origin there. And then subsequently, the Henschke's planted vines there, and the rest is history. This wine is anywhere you go in the world and you talk about Australia, this is a reference. We get, depending on the vintage, between 6 to 12 bottles a year, and we have 3 available. You know, some people say, you know, how can you charge 12,000, 13,000 rand for an Australian wine? I think when you understand in depth Australian wine, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't command the same price as the top wines from Australia, as the top wines from other parts of the world. And in fact, South Africa doesn't have a complex like that either. Henschke is the reference family winery Shiraz in Australia, and therefore one of the top in the world. And I can tell you, they could sell every bottle of this in Australia. I mean, they choose to export, but they are, I mean, it's, you name, the word Henschke is magical in Australia. Jess's family have distributed their wines internationally for 2 generations now, so it's, well, into the 2nd generation. So you've been distributing their wines, your family, for about, I don't know, 25, 26 years.
Yeah, and drinking wine together for a lot longer than that.
And you went to school with them as well. So, I mean, the name Henschke is really reeks of quality and of specialization. And
yeah, I mean, I had a privilege in 3 years ago to, there was a vertical tasting of this wine at New York Wine Experience. And tasting this wine was an ethereal experience, because I think It's a Shiraz like no Shiraz you've never tasted. There is an incredible depth and minerality to it, which I couldn't think it was possible. And it was, for me, it was the wine of the New York wine experience in that year. So the one controversy, obviously, to, I suppose, in international buyers is a screw cap, which is quite...
It's not a screw cap anymore. It's a Vinolok. It's the glass. It's the glass closure.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a whole different topic. We can have a masterclass just in that.
All of their wines are in screw cap except for the Hill of Grace. I stand open to correction, but Hill of Grace is definitely Vinolok now. It has been for a few years.
Well, yes, if you can afford it, and this is one wine that has to go in a cellar, and ages forever, I'd say, no, Alex?
Jeff, I
think we lost Alex.
Very well. I actually don't like them when they're young because they're very ripe and very rich. But with age, they're incredible. They're unbelievable. Jess, would you just give us some sort of feel for how Henschke, the name, resonates in South Australia?
It's synonymous with fine wine. I sometimes get asked if my last name is Yalumba, which I sometimes think is funny, but that would make sense. But Justine Henschke and I spend lots of time together, and so I've heard the stories of their vineyard and their wines over the years. And Stephen and Prue Henschke, as a husband and wife team, are a pretty formidable force because he's an incredible winemaker and she's a viticulturist. So together
probably Australia's most respected viticulturist.
Absolutely. So she's really been as a team, they've been at the forefront of really driving that message of terroir. Hill of Grace is a tiny old single vineyard, 100-year-old Shiraz vines in Eden Valley. And I think when you talk about Penfolds Grange and Henschke Hill of Grace, they are two of the most recognised names in Australian wine, but they couldn't be more different from one another in terms of the way that they approach their winemaking. And I think that's such a special...
and of course, Penfolds is part of a massive international group and is a huge producer. And credit to them to be able to maintain the quality of the Grange.
And I think so. And certainly Penfolds Grange has paved the way for the conversation to start about Australian fine wine. So we're grateful for putting us on the map in that upper echelons of the wine world. But Hill of Grace has certainly caught up in terms of recognition, and I think fine wine buyers around the world would certainly have this in their cellar.
That's actually prompted a thought. I actually often, and I don't know how it come, obviously the internet plays a part in it, but I get approached by buyers in China, in Asia, even North America, who contact me directly because we've got Hill of Grace and they want to buy it from me, of course, which we don't do. Extraordinary. They can buy it from you now.
So you mentioned Pussy Vale, which is what we're drinking. So on that note, I'm going to have a refill.
So I'm most of the way through the bottle, which just shows you how incredibly easy it is to quaff this. It was a revelation to me when I started going to Australia 20 odd years ago regularly. I never had a respect for Australian Riesling. In those days, one often associated Riesling with Liefram Milch and cheap German wines that you see in supermarkets in the UK. So I didn't take it seriously. And it was a couple of mates, one of whom owns a winery in Maclaren Vale, Steve Grimley, today, and another one who is the son of the owner of Rockford, Travis O'Callaghan. And we were at Anguston. We're in Anguston, sorry. We're at Vintner's Bar and Grill, which is a very legendary restaurant that belongs to the Hill Smith family, and where I live when I'm in the Barossa. That's where I live. It's the 96 Winery Road of the Barossa. And I'd been skeptical about Riesling, and so they took it upon themselves to freeze my whole afternoon. And we went for lunch at VBG, Vintner's Bar and Grill, and we spent the whole afternoon drinking Riesling. And they took me back several generations, including some old Leo Buring Rieslings, some old Lehmans, and others, Watervale Rieslings and Clare Valley Rieslings as well. And one of the ones that really stood out for me was Pusey Vale. And I knew that belonged to the Hill Smith, so that sparked my interest, and then I started following it. And I'd come across it once before in a significant manner when Yalumba turned 150. They're now 171, but when Yalumba turned 150, they did a huge tasting in the Barossa at the winery in Angaston, and another one in London, where they did where Rob organised historic tastings of from their cellar. So both their own wines, the wines of Australia, other producers, because they have a magnificent collection, plus wines of Europe. So each decade had different themes. So, for example, the 60s was wines of Bordeaux. The 70s was fascinating for me because the theme there was Pusey Vale under screw cap versus under cork. Because in 1978, I think it was, or 77, I think it was, do you remember, Jess? The first bottling ever in Australia of a premium wine under screw cap. So it was way ahead of...
I think.
So,
does that sound right?
Oh,
70.
I can't hear you. I think it was 78, but anyway, I could be wrong. But the point is, we were allowed to taste the 78 from bottle, from screw cap, and they bottled some under cork, and we were able to taste them side by side. And that was a seminal moment for me because I tasted, this was 21 years ago, I tasted, a 30-year-old or whatever it was then, Riesling under screw cap versus under cork, and the Riesling under screw cap was still varietal, was still tonic, was still there, was still alive, and the same wine under cork was completely dead and oxidized, and there were several bottles of each, so it wasn't just one bottle. You could go through it with a lot of people, and I did, and that turned on a light in my brain to say, well, hold on a second, there's more to this than meets the eye. But Pusey Vale itself is the original Riesling vineyard of Eden Valley. It's about 66 hectares. It's one vineyard, only Riesling. So it's one varietal, one focus. There are 4 wines that come from the vineyard. 3 of those are completely dry. And the 61 block is organic and has been since 2013. But the oldest block in the vineyard that survives today is from 1961, if I'm not mistaken, Jess.
Right. Yeah.
So the vineyard was planted 173 years ago. And interestingly, the cuttings that this vineyard comes from originally are those from the vines that came through James Busby in the Camden in 1933. So this links up to this vineyard. And Rob's father, so your grandfather, Wyndham, bought this from the owner who planted it entirely to Riesling. Yeah, it's been in the family.
Alex, I have a question from one of our viewers, Dan, who's asking if you can compare perhaps stylistically. How do you compare the Pusey Vale Riesling with the Rieslings from the Mosel? If they enjoy the same type of acidity and classic Riesling characteristics. So if you can give a bit of a profile in comparison.
So Aussie Riesling generally tends to be dry Riesling. It doesn't tend to be sweet. There are off-dry Rieslings, and there's one in this vineyard. I don't know if it's exported, but I've had it in Australia. But Aussie Riesling tends to be dry. It tends to be very limey. If you know Rose's lime cordial, there's like beam of lime through it. Chalky, high acidity, very refreshing. Alcohols tend to be 11.5 to 12.5, that sort of spectrum. They age incredibly well, but they're these bursts of energy, very mineral, incredibly citric, but on the lime spectrum wines, and they're sensational. They really are. Don't know if that answers your question.
This is everyone's everyday drinking wine is a Riesling. So this is a go-to white wine with everybody in South Australia and around Australia, but particularly in South Australia because
you're talking about the regular Pusey Vale as opposed to the Block 61.
Yes, but I think Riesling in general, South Riesling is just the go-to white wine.
It's a little bit like Chenin Blanc in South Africa Riesling is to Australia what Chenin Blanc is to South Africa, in that, not that it's grown in the same quantity as Chenin Blanc, but it is Australia's own white varietal. Chardonnay's everybody's, Sauvignon Blanc's everybody's, Pinot Grigio's everybody's. But Riesling, outside of one spot in Europe, or maybe two, it's Australian.
Yeah. And it's
very different styles,
it's a very amazing food wine as well.
Very, very good.
Jess, talk.
We're not trying to emulate a European style at all, and I think it's one of the refreshing things when we talk about Riesling. There is such a distinctly Australian style, and that's what I think is exciting when you talk about the similarities and how can you profile it against our European counterparts. You really can't match them against each other. They're totally different wines.
It's a parallel between South Africa Chenin Blanc and Loire Valley Chenin Blanc. They're also, we're not trying to emulate either, and they're very different. And South Africa has a unique Chenin, like you guys have a unique Riesling.
But
and that also varies from region to region within Australia. Clare Valley Rieslings are different to Eden Valley Rieslings, for example.
Yeah.
It's a great opportunity to taste them both. And I mean, I think especially in a time like this, it's a vehicle to travel and to feel, that you can somehow be somewhere else through a glass of wine.
Nick, you also on your site, you offer the regular Pusey Vale Riesling, which is probably the one I drink the most of. Yeah. Which is, even more better value than this, which we have more availability of. But
and we also just saw, because someone was just busy ordering as I saw it, so I can tell you.
Pusey Vale in Australia is synonymous with great Riesling. It's again it's part of the Yalumba family of vineyards, in that it belongs to the Hill-Smith family outright. And it's incredible. It's very rare that you have 66 hectares as one vineyard with one varietal anywhere in the world. Wow. And it's up in the hills. It's beautiful. It's got these undulating slopes. It's parallel. I mean, the vineyards follow the contours. In fact, the top wine from this vineyard is called the Contours Riesling, which ages beautifully. It's quite a sight. It really is. And I mean, sorry about the cliche, but every time I drive up there, I seem to bump into shitloads of kangaroos. They love it up there, up in Eden Valley, don't they?
Why we put them on the cover, Alex?
It's true, Jessica, right?
It's surrounded by 100-year-old gum trees and kangaroos, and it's that completely Australian landscape there. It's this little oasis from civilization, and it's just this little Riesling utopia.
Interestingly, and I should point this out, because in South Africa, gum trees are not loved at all because they're alien trees and they were brought in from Australia. Nothing grows under gum trees here. In Australia, all the plants grow under it because it's native. So you've got grass, you've got flowers, you've got everything. It's not dry at all. And it fits into the landscape beautifully. So gum trees in Eden Valley are beautiful.
And the equivalent of the kangaroo in the vineyard is a baboon here.
Yeah, but except the kangaroos don't eat the fruit.
Yeah, they're less troublesome.
The birds in Eden Valley are a big problem. Most of the vineyards have to be netted. It's really arduous.
Your sister just wanted to make a point here and said that this Riesling was in such high demand that the staff at Yalumba was not able to buy it for a while.
It's true.
Right.
I often tell the guys at Yalumba that we have Pusey Vale Riesling in our offering, and they can't even get it as a staff wine at Yalumba.
Do yourself a favor and add some Riesling to your cellar. This is amazing wine to drink with food, without food, in summer, in winter, indoors and outdoors.
And the other thing, just Nick, if I can say, this is scratching. We're starting now to scratch below the surface of what is cliched Australian wines. Blockbuster Shiraz and oaky Chardonnays that people assume are what Australia is all about. At this level, we're now starting to get into the finesse and the intricacy of what is fine wine in Australia, and what is regionality, and what is respected and loved in Australia.
Alex, what a beautiful landscape.
Can't take any credit. Adelaide Hills, very much it's sort of like the Swartlanders in South Africa, the area we've got a lot of the trendy young winemakers, the new generation, the young guns doing different things. The natural wine movement is pretty big up in Adelaide Hills. It's much cooler. If you go back to the map, I'll just show you where it is.
Yep.
It's south of the Barossa, but it's uphill all the way.
Yeah, the green one.
Right. So it's spread over a lot of area, but there's not a lot of planting because there are other types of agriculture, but it's also very hilly, and there's not a lot of vineyards in terms of concentration. And from Angaston, you go to Eden Valley, and then from Eden Valley to Adelaide, it takes about an hour and a half drive, going over the hills, and you have parcels of vineyard the whole way, but it's not a continuum like you have in the Barossa Valley.
But it's quite close to the city.
Cooler. A big pond?
It's quite close to the city, the vineyards?
The southernmost part of the Adelaide Hills is 20 minutes outside of the city. You cut into the main road, and then it's this big highway which takes you very steeply down and into the back of Adelaide, yes. So it's only, the heart of the Adelaide Hills is 40 minutes outside of Adelaide, depending on traffic. Don't do it on a Friday afternoon. Much cooler climate up there, higher elevation, proper winters, different soil types. Down in the Barossa, you've got a lot of loams and clays and what have you. There's a very different geology up in the even Eden Valley. One of the things I love about Eden Valley is you have quartz, and you have sandstone, and you have other influences, and the further you go up into the hills, the more irregularity you have in the geology compared to the Barossa floor, as they call it. Murdoch Hill is one of these emerging. It's sort of like the Molyneux of the Murdoch Hill, if you like, of Adelaide Hills. Perhaps a little bit more risky than that, but they're from another family business that have been working on the land for many generations. I think it's been since 1939 the family bought that vineyard. The Downey family, which are a famous name in Australia. Jess, you can probably touch on that in terms of politics. They are well known. Can you jump in?
Mr. Alexander Downing. I can talk about politics, but Michael Downing is another very good friend of mine, and I've been so impressed with watching his journey into the wine world, his family's footsteps. But when he started as a winemaker at Murdoch Hill, he totally transformed what Murdoch Hill was, and I think really put them on the map for a bit of a new wave of winemaking out of the Adelaide Hills. And I think it's these younger winemakers that are coming into the industry that are reinvigorating it and keeping it exciting. And he's doing some fantastic things with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir out of the Adelaide Hills. And this particular Rocket Chardonnay is one of my all-time favourite wines that he's made. And I did a little deal with him where we did a stock swap. So he snuck me some bottles of his Rocket Chardonnay, and I snuck him some bottles of Signature.
So the Rocket Chardonnay is magnificent. I mean, you taste it blind, and you'll be forgiven for thinking it's a Premier Cru Chassagne. It's absolutely beautiful.
It's one of the greatest Chardonnays you've ever tasted outside of Burgundy, and coming from Alex Dale.
Yeah.
I drank. You've tasted a lot of Chardonnay.
I've got one bottle left. I drank the rest already. I'm talking about under isolation. I've got one bottle left. I've got my last one. I drink it regularly. I absolutely love it. He also makes Pinot Meunier. I mean, I never associate Pinot Meunier with still wine. It's always, for me, a champagne varietal. But he makes a beautiful Pinot Meunier, which I drink regularly. Very light, very dainty, very pretty, which I drink chilled. And then, he's done sacrilegious things like blend Pinot Noir. Anybody who loves Pinot Noir will never blend it with anything, I thought. So I was very skeptical, but he has something called Pinot ×3, which is Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Gris, which is an absolutely delightful, refreshing,
like a family wine.
It's gorgeous. But he, just linking on to what Jess was saying, and I hadn't thought to mention that, but there are even within Australia, there's a new generation of winemakers that are shaking things up and have there's been a generational shift. I spoke about that a couple of weeks ago when we discussed Burgundy and Beaujolais. But if you take producers like, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but Achota Barrels, Gentle Folk, and Murdoch Hill from Adelaide Hills, they are part of the generation that's reshaping within Australia. And then obviously that's being translated into the export markets with the lag. The new face of the complexity of the Australian wine industry, and then you've got people like William Downey in Victoria, Patrick Sullivan, also Jamshed in Victoria, Cherubino wines in Western Australia, and little guys doing things like Riesling Freak in the Clare Valley, purely on Riesling, and these guys are really they're doing exactly what the young generation of superstars out of South Africa are doing. They're just taking it to another level. And this Chardonnay, I didn't know which one of their wines to show, and I thought, let's just show the Chardonnay, because Chardonnay is a major category in Australia. It deserves to be talked about. And for me, in today's generation, this is one of the leading wines in the country.
So, Alex, I have a question in terms of vinification. How much oak? What type of oak?
He's much of a purist, as you may have guessed from what Jess said, and it's natural ferments. As the oak is he uses barrels, of course, but it's invisible. His wines, his reds tend to be slightly cloudy. There may be a little bit of sediment, a little bit of CO2, but not too funky. But the Rocket Chardonnay is like precise. And it's beautiful. It's a stunning wine. It really is.
Amazing. We have 40 bottles, and it's quite something quite unique. So, like a flagship of the young generation Chardonnay. So, I think it's something definitely need to be tried, especially if you recommend it as one of the best.
And Jess is correct. I mean, he's really, the family have been farming there since 1939. But in the 7 years or so that he's been in charge of the place, he's really garnered recognition for the first time for this family business. One to watch.
Perfect.
She's moving.
She's moving, and we're moving as well. So we are moving over to Victoria. Alex, you would like to introduce the Yarra Valley?
Yeah. Can you go back to the map quickly?
Yes, I'll do it now. Sorry, 1 second. So in the meantime, I'm trying to cope with the orders that are coming in. The map. Here we go. No, the big one we need.
Yeah, right at the beginning. So Victoria, you see Melbourne in the south there, and all that around it. So about an hour east of Melbourne is the Yarra Valley. But Victoria's actually got a number of different wine regions. Some of them are very famous. Yarra Valley was probably the first. More recently, as I mentioned earlier, just below Melbourne on the peninsula, you've got Mornington Peninsula, which has been quite famous for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But Yarra, over the years, was more famous for Méthode Champenoise, or sparkling wine, and Chardonnay, and even Pinot Noir. James Halliday famously was one of the early success stories from his own winery in Yarra with Pinot. But I think the significant thing about Victoria is that it had the advantage of not having the same history as the Barossa, and so it wasn't weighed down by the same tradition. I mean, obviously Victoria and Yarra has been making wine for a long time, but there's been a more progressive edge to the wine industry in Victoria, and I think a lot of that driven by the swing towards cooler climate wines. And whereas you do find in South Australia, such as in Eden Valley, such as Adelaide Hills, you do find pockets of genuinely cool climate vineyards and viticulture. It's more widespread in Victoria. So I think as people have looked for in addition to the traditional wines out of the Barossa and what have you, the Victoria wine regions have been gaining in popularity and recognition around the world. And I've it's difficult to know which ones to choose, and we've only got 10 wines in this presentation. So I chose one from a producer that I really rate and I've been following for a number of years now, and that's Jamshed. here we go, in Yarra. And like a lot of people who are making some of the most switched on wines today around the world, they had other careers first and then came to wine afterwards, intellectually inquisitive and already had, ideas about what they wanted to do. And so Gary Mills, who is the owner and founder of Jamshid, started life as a teacher. He had a bachelor's degree in literature. He went to teach English in Japan, came home, he was from Western Australia, so did vintages in Western Australia, and then went further afield and worked several years under Paul Draper in California at Ridge, which is, in terms of California, it's his best, one of the best you can get. And when he came home to Australia and was by then completely converted to wine, he decided, he could start anywhere. And he was most interested in cool climate sites. And he looked at different parts of Australia, and he settled on Victoria because of its array of different areas of that nature. And so he has wines from different parts of Victoria, including 2 from the Yarra Valley. One that the one that stands out for me, the one that I like the most, is his Seville Syrah, which is the one that I'm featuring here. Moving on to red. So
featuring literally.
There we go. So interestingly, he calls it Syrah, not Shiraz, and that's not a rejection of the Barossa, because the Barossa owns and is famous for and is respected for Shiraz.
It's a question
in the
of style.
Australian style. I think in Victoria, I've very rarely seen Shiraz. Most often you'll see Syrah, and I do the same with my own Syrah in South Africa. It's not because I'm rejecting Shiraz as a name. It's just that if you see Syrah on the bottle, you have a different perception of stylistically what you're going to be drinking. And I think that's fair dinkum, as you say over in Oz. It's not pretentious. It's not anything else. It's purely that you're giving an indication of stylistically what you're trying to achieve. He, like a lot of the names that I mentioned earlier, are very influenced by more natural winemaking, not in the dogmatic sense, but more organic production, more sustainable viticulture, less additives and what have you, etc., etc. By the way, a lot of which Yalumba has adopted and is a leading and has been awarded multiple times in terms of green viticulture and innovation. But he makes clean natural wines, if I can call it that.
In comparison to South Africa, would you say this is very much like a style that like the Molyneux pursue, or
yeah, I think that's a good comparison. Better than the comparison I made with Murdoch Hill, actually. I'm drinking the 24. Obviously, it is the 2014. It's absolutely beautiful. It's got that sort of peppery spice, but it's got some richness that you'd expect from Australia, but completely toned down. It's poised, full of flavour, but some restraint on it. It's a joy to drink. It really is. This is my last bottle at home as well. I can't wait for us to be able to transport wine again, because I've drunk it all. He's very specialised in Syrah. Gary, he makes some of the best Syrahs in Australia today. I think that's generally recognised in this style. He also makes some aromatic whites. His Roussanne. He makes some Riesling. Makes a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. But I think he even makes some Pinot Noir. Actually, some pretty good Pinot Noir. But I think his Syrahs are what he's most famous for at this point. He owns the first urban winery in Melbourne as well. It's quite a character. He's very loyal following in Melbourne, and if you've got a loyal following in Melbourne, you don't really need to export, because it's a pretty powerful market, and the gastronomy in Melbourne is amazing. It is the gastronomic capital of Australia, without a doubt. Sydney has its share of great restaurants, but Melbourne is just incredible. It's like Lyon in France. There's just restaurants everywhere, and the quality levels are incredible. And interestingly, the Seville area, sub-region within the Yarra, is gaining in recognition for Syrah. I mentioned actually in my notes, which you can see on the screen, that Seville Estate, which is one of Gary's neighbours there, in 2019 Holiday Guide was named as Winery of the Year. So that part of Australia, that part of Victoria is really gaining in recognition for this style of Syrah, and I really recommend it. I bought a lot from them. It's been a difficult sell because people in South Africa, think of Australian Syrah as alcoholic and sweet, which it doesn't need to be at all. This is as good as any Northern Rhone wine we have on our list. It's brilliant.
Wow!
And look at the price; it's fantastic.
Sensational. Thank you, Alex.
Jess, do you want to add anything to Victoria? From your perception.
No, I just agree with what you're saying about the Syrah Shiraz terminology. It's purely, we were talking about it today actually, that it's just an indication of the style of wine, and we do commonly see Syrah coming from cooler climate regions. So it's been adopted widely across Australia that cooler climate Shiraz has been called Syrah for a while now.
But, you do have cooler climate Syrah in South Australia. Look at the Henschke Hill of Grace. That's in Eden Valley, and that's right at the top of Eden Valley as well. It's high up there, Keaton. Yeah. But that's a riper style still. Whereas
too.
Yeah. But in Victoria, it's more of the savoury side of Syrah, as well as the cooler climate side. It's more of the savoury side.
Yeah.
All right.
Alex, I think you were looking forward also to chat about Tasmania, quite a special region.
Yeah, just before we move on to Tasmania, I think in Victoria, just before we finish on Victoria, there's a lot of very good Chardonnay, and the region has made a name for itself, again in more European style, if I can call it that, more Australian style Chardonnay, and there's some great Pinot Noirs. So Australia has this reputation for a certain type of wine, but there are big names in different parts of the country, whether it's Cabernet from Cullen or from Vassar Felix or from, whatever, from Western Australia, Margaret River. You have, in South Australia, you've got producers like our friend Gary, who's making beautiful modern Syrahs here. In Tasmania, moving on to that, you've got completely different styles now which are emerging. The vineyards have been planted there for approaching half a century now, 45 years or so. It's much, much cooler in Tasmania. If you go back to your map.
Yeah.
For those who don't know it. It's off the south coast. There you go. It is distinctly cooler in Tasmania, and even from even the northern part of the island and the southern part of the island, there's a big temperature variation. And it's really, also with global warming impacting and whether you attribute the mass bushfires to global warming or not, it's undeniable that global warming is impacting on Australia as it is on South Africa, as it is on France and everywhere else. Tasmania is really coming into its own. So even though viticulture has existed there for almost half a century, it's really in the last 10 years or so that things are really coming to the surface. Things are bubbling at the surface. And again, Jess's father was a visionary in this regard. He has invested in vineyards there for quite some time now, before it became popular. Other people have invested since, including his cousin, Michael Hill-Smith, who's also very well known. He's an MW. And Rob owns today, and his family own Jantz, which is Australia's most successful premium sparkling wine producer. I love, Rob coined the phrase méthode tasmanoise. And I was talking to you earlier about not using French terms like méthode champenoise, and when that was banned, Rob came up with that and actually trademarked it, which was very clever. But he is very clever. So there you go. But without a doubt, Jantz is the most highly regarded sparkling wine house in Australia today, and they make several wines. And I picked the rosé because I don't drink a lot of sparkling wine. Those who know me know that I drink next to none. But if I'm going to drink one, it has to be Pinot dominant, and this is predominantly Pinot. I think it's 3/4 Pinot, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And the history of Jantz, and Jess, you should take over from me because it's your family estate here. But it originally, Bollinger, or in fact Roederer, originally Roederer spotted this, owned it, planted it, and take it from there. How did your family get involved?
Yeah, so Roederer had been looking for a new world site that emulated the conditions that they had in Champagne. So they found this site in the northern part of the Tasmanian island in Piper's Brook, and they planted a vineyard there. And for some reason, Dad got involved with Tasmania and is a lover of Champagne and is an absolute lover of Pinot Noir. So it had been on his mind to find a premium Pinot Noir producing region in Australia and somewhere that he could make sparkling wine. So he got in touch with the people that had planted this vineyard at Roederer, and they had a joint venture with an Australian family here called Heemskirk. And he badgered them for years about selling him their vineyard. And 10 years later, he was successful. And
so that was in the late 90s, right?
Yeah, I think it was about 97 that we purchased the Jantz vineyard. So along with the name and the vineyards and the property, we purchased Jantz. And I've asked Dad a couple of times, but really the reason for Roederer to walk away was not anything to do with the site. It was just the cost of managing a vineyard that was so far away from where they
it's pretty remote.
Yeah. And so for a champagne house to travel almost 48 hours to get to their vineyard just wasn't, they lost the interest in the project, and Dad was there to snap it up when they were ready to walk away from it.
And that was, he really was ahead of the curve there, because Tasmania was not on anybody's radar then at all.
No, not
those vines were originally planted in 1975, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
and then
1975.
Roederer purchased it a decade later.
And
and much our ethos with Vale, this is a 100% dedicated sparkling wine brand. So it is only makes sparkling wine, which I think is why it's become so synonymous with Australian sparkling wine. And Tassie certainly is looked to as a leading region in Australia for premium sparkling. And now you're seeing amazing Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays coming from Tasmania as well.
It's interesting that you have in Tasmania, you actually have some significant limestone undersoil, geology, which is obviously very good for sparkling wine as well.
Absolutely.
You find that a little bit in limestone coast, sort of south of the Coonawarra, but in the Barossa itself, you don't get those sort of conditions. And for making these types of wines, Méthode Tasmanoise, in a cool climate with that sort of geology is absolutely ideal, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a very beautiful part of the world. And the name, you've written it here, but I'll explain that the name Jantz has come from the European explorer that discovered the island. So his name was Abel Jansoon Tasman, and he first spotted the island in 1642, and the vineyard was named after him. So it's a famous name now in Australia for sparkling wine, and I'm really excited to see the rest of the world really noticing how incredible the sparkling from Tassie is.
I think if I can just clarify, when you say sparkling wine, this is second fermentation in bottles, so it's the classics method. It's the same way champagne is being done, and in the same way our own Méthode Cap Classique. So just so it's a very, very prestigious.
Now, interestingly, sticking with Tasmania, although it's not part of the slideshow, your dad subsequently then invested further in Tasmania in the same area, but in Pinot Noir predominantly, but in still wine and table wine. And he bought Dalrymple, and you guys have been taking that to another level. I've been following that very closely. We were the first, South Africa was the first export market to ever get an allocation of Dalrymple Pinot Noir. I don't know how I managed that, but I did. But Dalrymple is really starting to gain in prominence as well. And that's Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, especially a little bit of Sauvignon, but basically those two.
We actually...
Yeah, and even now it's Pinot Noir dominant. So we make a Tasmanian blend, and then there's 4 single sites. So it's really looking at the diversity of these little plots all across Tasmania and looking at the significant difference in terroir across that state. So it's a really, I think the more, and you've mentioned global warming, but I think Tassie as a cool climate premium region within Australia has really taken the attention of everybody. I think as the love for Pinot continues to grow, people are really looking to Tassie for their top shelf Pinots.
Cool.
And I think, I mean, we're receiving a huge influx of orders on this one. So it's obviously, it's a novelty, it's very exotic, and it's extremely interesting. I think people, I mean...
Nick, we also have the vintage cuvee as well, which is phenomenal. And then the premium brut, which is, you know, the, dare I say it, the sort of the everyday wine, but it's brilliant. It's absolutely superb. And again, thanks to the agreement that we have, Yalumba, and the fact that they charge us in rands and they guarantee the price for a year, we're able to pass these on at very, very, very good value. And by the way, as an importer, we take a lower margin on Australian Kiwi wines than we do French wines because of this tax. So there's this combination of factors which allows us to still deliver value, despite it. Next wine.
Yeah.
So moving on to New Zealand, I don't think we've got the time to go into the depth because this has gone on for much longer than I thought it would. I'm not going to go into the depth. I think people are going to receive this. I had quite a few points to point out, but I'm not going to. You can send this presentation to everybody that wants. Maybe we should just move on to the wines. What do you think, Nick? Because
absolutely.
I
mean, I think you can just give an idea of New Zealand in terms of percentage of production. I mean, so that's quite interesting. I think you can...
So I think you know the one point is that Australia was planted ahead of New Zealand, but New Zealand started very much through James Busby as well. 1960s Vitis vinifera vines were reintroduced because they'd been pulled out because of the problem with phylloxera and what have you. Müller-Thurgau, so Germanic varieties in the 80s were big, and then all of a sudden Sauvignon Blanc came onto the scene. Sauvignon Blanc and New Zealand wine are synonymous. Here's a stat: the biggest category of wine sold in Australia, single category, is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Dreadful stat, but truth. So New Zealand ran the risk of becoming a one-trick pony with Sauvignon Blanc, and I mean, look at that. I mean, look at the dominance of Sauvignon Blanc, and it's become commoditized to a degree, which is not in New Zealand's interest. And there's been, we'll find out in a minute what some people are starting to do to change that. But Pinot Noir obviously is very famous coming from New Zealand. It's outside of Burgundy, one of the most respected regions for Pinot Noir. Chardonnay can be fabulous coming out of New Zealand. We have a number of really good Chardonnays coming out of New Zealand, including from Jess's family vineyard there, which is called Nautilus. The Chardonnay is incredible. Pinot Gris, and then others. We bring in some Grüne Veltliner Riesling from one of our producers, but it's quite limited still. Some people are trying Albarino. There are various other things that are being trialed, but the varietal spread in New Zealand is quite limited. Okay.
So obviously Marlborough has been the first, the center of Sauvignon Blanc, and I think the first planting was there, I believe, of Sauvignon Blanc in the 70s.
So what I decided to do was, and forgive me for following the cliche of Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir, but that does summarize a lot of the the story of New Zealand. So I've selected Marlborough for Sauvignon Blanc and Central Otago for Pinot Noir. Marlborough really is where the reputation of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, especially in terms of the international fame, originated, and no more so than thanks to Cloudy Bay, which today belongs to the LVMH. We spoke about them last week with my last talk, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Nicolò de l'Ombre in Saint-Denis. Cloudy Bay really was the iconic producer of Sauvignon Blanc that put New Zealand on the map internationally. Even to this day, it's got this sort of buzz about the name and this recognition, which is and very premium feel about it, which is fantastic. And interestingly, the founder winemaker of Cloudy Bay was Kevin Judd, and Kevin Judd was responsible for making the first 25 vintages of Cloudy Bay, before going off on his own. And when he established his own winery, he wanted to work obviously at a much, much smaller scale and far more viticulturally driven. And also looking at other sides of the grape aspect, becoming quite a, I hate to use the word iconic, but it's becoming a reference Sauvignon Blanc of the new styles, the alternative styles. I think New Zealand's desperate to prove that there's more to Sauvignon Blanc than stainless steel fermented, inoculated Sauvignons that are bottled within 4 months and drunk and urinated by the end of the year. And Grey Wacky is his own winery, his own wine. He actually makes the wine at a friend's winery. It's called Dog Point, who's also one of his growers. And Grey Wacky is the name of the bedrock or the main stone type across New Zealand, and very prevalent in this area. And so he wanted to give recognition to Grey Wacky. Not to put his name on it, because his name was so associated with Cloudy Bay that he, somebody's baby, somebody's kid.
Mine.
And so the Wild Sauvignon is not released as young as most Sauvignon Blancs from New Zealand. It's a natural ferment. It's in older oak. There's malolactic fermentation. There's a lot of textural and aromatic complexity. And when you first taste it, if you taste it blind, as I did the first time I ever tried it, I didn't pick it as coming from New Zealand. I was convinced it was from Europe. And I don't mean that as condescendingly to New Zealand. It's just I wasn't expecting that, because I was also locked into that vision of Kiwi Sauvignon Blanc, And it's a beautiful wine, and they age incredibly well. I've had some of these wines going back to the sort of early to mid 2000s, which is still incredibly fresh, very vibrant, and I think is a more exciting second generational Sauvignon Blanc story coming out of New Zealand.
So Central Otago is quite an extreme winemaking region, I believe. So I think is one of the southernmost, if not the southernmost winemaking region in the world, Alex.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if Chile has anything more southern. I've never asked the question, but yeah, it's very far south. Can you just bring up the map?
Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, it's here.
There you go. Now, parts of it have, hints of continentality, in that, you have humidity in the summer, and it's very cold in the winter. The soils vary tremendously, because there's quite a lot of hillsides. If you go back to that picture you were showing.
Yeah.
There you go. So there's quite a lot of undulating hillsides and what have you. So that the aspects do play an important role. Obviously, the northern facing slopes are warmer, the southern facing slopes are much cooler. And there are, I think, there are various regions in New Zealand that make Pinot Noir. I think most regions in New Zealand, I think probably all of them make Pinot Noir today. And there are, a number of very famous Pinot producers. But I think Central Otago is, if you take the most consistently premium region that is really dedicated to Pinot Noir, Central Otago, I think, takes that crown. There are a number of very famous producers there. I think Felton Road is probably the most famous, the Block 5 Pinot. Mount Difficulty, incidentally also owned by a former South African. Vineyards like Peregrine and others. And Burn Cottage was really not necessarily a latecomer, but wasn't one of the early ones to emerge from Central Otago. But one of the things I love about Burn Cottage is that from the outset, it has been designed to be totally ideological and purist. And it's been biodynamic since day one. It hasn't worked towards it, hasn't converted into organics. And then they started as biodynamic. It's owned by a very wacky individual called Marquis Sauvage, who looks like one of the guys out of ZZ Top. I mean, he's got this ridiculous beard, and he's big heavy metal fan. Very complex character. He's American. He owns various import and distribution businesses in the States. I work with him in Illinois, in Chicago, for example. but he also owns beautiful vineyards in Germany, and he's a big Riesling fan. And he scoured the earth looking for a top Pinot site, and that could have been Burgundy, it could have been Oregon, it could have been anywhere. And having literally scoured the world for years and years and years, he came across Central Otago, and he came across this one particular vineyard. Well, it wasn't a vineyard; it was one particular farm, a particular area, and he was able to snap it up at auction under the noses of many of the locals who didn't suspect a foreigner would be in the auction. And he set up Burn Cottage, and he brought in a friend of his, who's Ted Lemon, who Literary Wines in California, who makes beautiful Pinots, and Claire Mulholland, who's the winemaker, who's been there since the get-go, who's brilliant. Has a fantastic team, and they make today probably one of the reference Pinot Noirs in New Zealand. It's my favourite. I buy quite a lot of it for myself. I drink it regularly. I don't have any to drink today because I finished my last bottle in isolation. But it is one of my absolute favourites. For me, it's like a Premier Cru Burgundy. And there's one little anecdote that I like to tell about Marquis, or Marquis as I call him. And that is that he was so determined from his first release to only allow what's, the most stunning wine under the label Burn Cottage, that his first vintage or two, he didn't sell under the label because he couldn't bring himself to put this ideological label that he conceived and he contrived, which is quite an interesting label and very much linked into biodynamics and what have you.
Inspired by Goethe, no?
Yes, yeah. So he didn't want to release a wine that he wasn't 100% satisfied with. And so, despite all the costs in establishing the vineyard, the years of, the payroll and the investments that he made, the first vintage or two, he didn't bottle as Burn Cottage. He did bottle it. So I remember when he told me this story, I was having dinner with him in Chicago, and he actually brought a bottle along with him. And I said, well, so what did you call it? And he said, Burn Cash, which is literally what happened. I mean, he burnt, cash for the first couple of years until he could hit the ideal that he set for the domain, for the estate, and hasn't looked back since. It's really become, in the space of a decade, a reference Pinot Noir from New Zealand, and that's why I included it here. I would like to add, before I forget, that Jess and her family own one of the most established wineries in New Zealand, and in Marlborough, and they make exceptional Pinot Noir, Sauvignon, and great Chardonnay, and Pinot Gris for that matter. But we've sold out, so couldn't include that.
So
there you go. That's the presentation.
And with this amazing picture, which looks fake, and
it's real,
does really want to entice us to travel. I also like to obviously open the floor for questions if there are any, and start thanking you guys as well, because first of all, Jessica, thank you so much for opening up your home, literally, your family, to giving us some insights on your properties and your personal experiences. I think I said to Alex the other day when we held our first masterclass on Burgundy, and I said it's interesting that we came to, inspired to organize these conferences, video conferences, only whilst in lockdown. And why don't we have we not always done this? Because it's an incredible way to connect with the producers and the families around the world of the wines that we represent. And one thing we stand for, and that's why Alex and I get along so well on the wine side, is that we love to tell the story behind the labels. And I mean, there's no better way than actually convey it in person, and technology is allowing us to do this. And while
thanks for staying up late, Jess.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was
What's
great
the time?
to chat to you.
It's 11:30.
way past your bedtime.
So really thank you so much, and please extend my gratitude to your dad as well, and your sister, which has joined us from London, I believe. Am I correct?
Yeah.
I really hope.
Lucy did a vintage in South Africa 2017 at Radford Dale, by the way, and she made her own wine. It's beautiful Pinotage.
Yes, I did.
So I really hope we can visit in person one day and meet you all in person once we're free again. Alex, thank you. You've prepared this talk. You've spent a lot of time, invested a lot of time in the last couple of days to convey insights on each wine and each region, and it's really invaluable. And I think everyone that attended and has spent the last 2.5 hours with us can really appreciate it. Everyone that loves wine, I think, had now an opportunity to travel, even if only.
Can I finish with one comment, Nick? And it's a comment that I make every time I go to Australia about South African wines, and that is that Australian wines deserve far more respect in South Africa. There seems to be this chip on the shoulder about Aussie wines, less so about New Zealand wines, probably linked to the All Blacks, I don't know. But we really should be more open-minded about Australian wines, look to them for inspiration the same way we do to Europe. And we're on the same team, you know, we're a Southern Hemisphere country trying to develop regionality and stylistic difference and integrity and provenance in our wines. And we really should stick together and be more respectful of what they've achieved. They've arguably achieved more than us at this stage. They didn't have a head start, but they didn't go through the same problems that South Africa did. So they do have a head start in terms of viticulture and winemaking. But you know, there are a lot of parallels between our countries, and I just wish we had a lot more respect for the wines and enjoyed the wines and tried them more often. And hopefully today's talk will get people to give them another chance.
Well, but I mean, until there are ambassadors like you, Alex, then there is a hope.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Lucky. Thank you for championing the wines. Jess, lovely to see you.
And I think you can eat the bottles now. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.